I spent today on the Vovchansk axis talking to artillerymen primarily. It wasn't just artillerymen, but it was mostly artillerymen, press officers. This isn't the first time I've been on the Vovchansk axis. In fact, I've been on the Vovchansk axis now for the better part of a week, talking to infantrymen, talking to air defense crews, talking to drone pilots, talking to people working on the forward operating position, 350 meters from the gray zone, about half a mile from Russian positions, to air defense units 8 kilometers from the front, artillery teams 6 kilometers from the front. So I think I've been getting a pretty diverse perspective from a bunch of different soldiers all across the Vovchansk axis. Now, it wasn't just the Vovchansk axis specifically.
Morally corrupt,
now,
bankrupt man.
there was also the Lipsky axis, which is the axis right next to Vovchansk, but they're both part of the same offensive into the Kharkiv area. Most people just know it by the Vovchansk axis, though, because that's the city that the Russians have been able to enter and is being fought over currently. And I wanted to talk about some conclusions that I took from my conversations with soldiers, from my experience on the ground, from seeing the targets that are getting hit, from seeing the people that aren't getting hit.
Bankrupt man.
Oh, a car alarm's going off. I think an explosion might have been a little closer than usual. Let me close the window quick. Nobody else on Twitch, okay, deals with these problems. Oh, sorry, the bombardment is too close. The car alarms are going off. Let me close my window before we continue. Be right back. So I spent a lot of time talking to all these soldiers, trying to get a read of the reports that I've heard from the government, the reports I've heard from the media, and seeing if they match up with what I'm seeing on the ground. Now, I'm not trying to preload my notions, so I'm going in saying, hey, here's my conclusion, can you please confirm it? But with so much news already out there about Vovchansk, I had to ask about some of the big developments, some of the things that people are saying are having an impact, to see if it really is, and to see if the reports of the Russians being stopped are real. So the first things first, every single soldier that I've talked to has gotten back to me with the report that their area, if I've asked about the topic, that is, that their area of the front has stabilized. Now, they're all very quick to say that they don't have an overall strategic view of the situation around Vovchansk. Obviously, if I'm talking to some like 59-year-old soldier digging a trench like 1 kilometer from the Russians, he does not see the map that Siersky or Zelensky or Yarmak or any of these bigwigs are seeing. He sees what's in his area. He hears the FPVs. He hears the glide bombs. He hears the artillery. He sees the difference in ammunition that he's getting. He sees the intensity or lack of intensity in Russian attacks in his area, right? So the best that I can do here, conceivably, is string these different testimonies I've gotten together along with the strategic vision that we're getting from both the media, the government, etc. And from my conversations with soldiers, their areas of the front have been stabilized. Whether it was when I was on the forward operating position, whether it was when I was talking to other soldiers that were a little bit further back from the forward operating position, I've gotten the read back that the situation is stabilized. And from the artillery crew we visited today, we heard from them, and a lot of this is going to be revealed when we put footage out on YouTube of our actual conversations with them. And I'm not going to tell you guys everything because I need to give you a reason to actually see the on-the-ground journalism that I'm over here filming. But the first 3 days that they were here, they fired 300 shells in one artillery team. Now, if you have been following this war for a while, or if you have noticed the rate of fire from Ukrainian guns for, say, the last year and a half, you'd know that that is a tremendous amount of fire to come from a single artillery piece, a 122 millimeter, by the way. But the last few days, it's been closer to 3 to 5 or 6, something in that range. Now, personally, I think it makes sense that when the offensive starts, you try to break the tip of the spear. That makes sense. But I do think this is also correlative of the fact that the intensity of the Russian attacks has decreased. And while there were some people that I've talked to that didn't emphasize a de-intensification of Russian attacks, what the general testimony I was getting back is that the intensification of Russian attacks, particularly when it comes to like S-300, S-400s into the general Kharkiv area, have gone down. And if you look at fire maps, that means areas of activity where you can see Russian fire into the Volchansk area, into the Kharkiv area, it has also gone down. So the data seems to match up with it. Testimony seems to match up with it. The Russian intensity of their push in Volchansk has decreased, and we're getting back reports of stabilization. This is the same reports that we're getting back from the Ukrainian government. This is also similar reports to what we're getting back from other media outlets. So the two big things that I can say that I'm reading from the situation is, number one, that the front has stabilized, and number two, that the intensity of the Russian attack in the Volchansk area has gone down. Now, by how much, I can't give you a precise estimate. You can go look at the publicly available data online. I'm sure there's some OSCENT that you guys can go dig into, but those are the bare bones conclusions I can take away. Now, from those bare bones conclusions, why is this the case? Well, one thing that we heard today from talking to artillery crews is that once there was approval to strike the Russians over the border in the Kharkiv area, across the border from the Kharkiv area into the Belgorod area, where there were previous restrictions on, say, the use of HIMARS or American munitions to strike inside of Russia, now that that restriction has been lifted, the Russians have gotten pounded across the border, where a lot of their logistics were supporting offensive operations, where armored vehicles were moving, where S-300s and S-400s were operating, including launch systems that were firing weapons into the Kharkiv area, leading to not only a de-intensification of the attack on Volchansk, the attack on Lipsky, the Kharkiv offensive, but also just general attacks on the city of Kharkiv itself that has led to the city, to be quite blunt, being a very crap place to live for the people who have to deal with that bombardment on a day-to-day basis. And this brings me back to the conversation that I've been having for a while on the channel, where the West cannot both not give Ukraine the air defense necessary to defend itself, while also dictating terms that it cannot use the weapons at its disposal to attack the launch pads, the S-300s, the S-400s, the air bases which attacks on Ukraine is being launched from. Now, I think this shows exactly why that logic makes sense, because now that they've been given approval, we saw a lowering of these types of attacks on Kharkiv, but that logic has not been taken to its natural conclusion. The approval has only been in the Belgorod region, in the regions, this is the area generally surrounding Kharkiv. If there's an air base in Kursk that launches an air attack on, say, Sumy, by the current restrictions placed upon Ukraine by the United States government, the Ukrainians would not be able to strike that air base and disable the place that is launching bombs at civilian infrastructure, killing civilians, killing military personnel, and harming Ukraine. But this is at the same time that we are still not providing them enough air defense systems to reliably shoot down those munitions, putting the Ukrainians in an incredibly difficult position. And this is why not only foreign governments in Europe and many of Ukraine's allies, including the Ukrainian government itself, is pressuring the Biden administration to move on this policy, but it is also why domestically we're seeing Democrats and Republicans, including Mike Johnson, who is somebody who really dragged his feet with the rest of his party on getting Ukraine aid over here, is starting to hit Biden on this issue, saying, hey, it's time to stop micromanaging the Ukrainian war effort. But this is kind of a tangent, bringing it back. I think that that's definitely one reason as to why this has been blunted and the intensification of the Russian attacks has gone down. The Ukrainians also redeployed troops into the area, and they took troops out of the Donetsk region into the Kharkiv region, and that obviously complicated it for the Russians. The Russians are now also running into a lot of Ukrainian defensive fortifications, or at least when I say a lot, I mean more than they initially did, and that is also complicating their continued offensive efforts. There's also something that I'm finding to be true, and the data seems to bear it out, and I'm also finding it out to be true on the ground, which I think is interesting, which is the fact that the Russians are not using many vehicles to attack the Volchansk axis. It's mostly infantry assaults. It's mostly infantry trying to creep into the gray zone in advance and try to move forward. the majority of vehicles getting destroyed on the Volchansk axis is Ukrainian. And that doesn't mean that, you know, oh my gosh, the Russians in Volchansk are so skilled and they're just destroying so much Ukrainian equipment. Oh my gosh, you know, the Ukrainians are getting real sloppy. They don't know what they're doing. A lot of this just to do with the fact that the Russians are just not using vehicles in the Volchansk axis. Not no vehicles, but a lot less, which makes it so this is the only area across the whole front line where the Russians are losing less vehicles than Ukrainians. And when I talked to artillery crews and press officers about this on the ground today, they seem to report back to me that, yeah, actually that is what we're seeing. It's mostly infantry assaults that they are combating. I think another reason, that could be part of the reason that's hurting the Russians. If you don't have one tool at your disposal, that could compromise your ability to engage in mechanized assault if you don't have the mechanized part of the assault. I think another reason as to why that this has been quite difficult for the Russians is that Putin's bet, if it was that aid would stop, certainly hasn't paid off yet. And whether he thought that this aid package that was held up in Congress for so long was going to continue to be held up, it wasn't. It was passed, all $61 billion, including another $1.9 billion that was just found because they mismanaged the finances on this. Now, let me be specific because some people just think this is like money magic. What happens is that, let's say that there's a piece of equipment valued at $20 million when it was originally built, say 50 years ago. We'll send it over to Ukraine. We'll say we gave them $20 million worth of equipment, but then you'll look at its market value and it's worth $5 million. And so we'll adjust that and say, no, never mind. We said it was 20. We actually only gave $5 million. Now we have an extra 15 million to pull from US stocks and support Ukraine. We just found that again with about $1.9 billion of equipment. This is the fourth time, I think, now that this has happened. But I just wanted to clarify that so you don't think it's literally just magic money. Point is, though, that support has started to arrive. Not only when it comes to armored vehicles, but when it comes to 155 millimeter shells. Now, the team we were with today were operating 122 millimeter. So those shells aren't really necessarily going to support them directly. It could maybe support the fire teams that are close to them and stuff and help them through that way. But they're also seeing an uptick in shells, the 122 millimeter teams. They have reported that back to me as well. Not as much as the 155 millimeter teams, but they are also getting support. That could be maybe from the Czech initiative, and I'm hearing from them that they're starting to receive the shells from the Czech initiative this month as well, which coincides with media reports. So that seems to be something that the media has gotten correct, is that this month is when the Czech initiative is really starting to kick into gear. So I think it's a combination of ammunition arriving to the front, restrictions on Ukrainian strikes across the border being lifted, might be an impact on a lack of armored vehicles on the side of the Russian assaults, and running into entrenched Ukrainian position along with redeployment of Ukrainian troops. Now, I'm not a military expert. I am merely giving you guys my musings. We'll use the word musings. My musings about talking to soldiers, reflecting with them, taking from their conclusions, combining that with information we already have accessible to us. But the long and short of it is the Russians have been stopped in Kharkiv. Now, this is honestly kind of an understatement, because the Russians haven't just been stopped in Kharkiv. They've been given a bloody nose over the border. And they have started to take some pretty
Burns is an immoral,
nasty casualties.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Hey, Ontario Rockhound, thank you so much for subscribing at tier 1 on a 14-month, well, it's not a 14-month streak, but you've been sub for 14 months. Take my money? You know what? I was divided.
Burns is an immoral,
but I will take it.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Hey, Skidsnorsk, thank you so much for the sub. I appreciate that. Come on, Gutter Chat, you have that Juicy Prime sub. Did you drop a Juicy Prime sub? And that's true. If you have an Amazon Prime account and you connect it to your Twitch account, you get a free sub you can give the channel. We're only one sub away from a hype train anyway. Just think about it. So those are my conclusions as to why the Russians had
Burns
the tip of their spear
immoral,
break here.
Morally corrupt.
Oh my gosh, you guys are really throwing out the subs right now. Your name is interesting to say. Pestrigial. Pestrigi? I don't know how to say your name, but it is unique, and I appreciate the tier 1 sub. And now we have a level 1 hype train at 93%. My goodness. Look at that. All that beautiful, beautiful support. So those are my musings.
Burns is an immoral,
My goodness.
morally corrupt,
We're getting more
bankrupt
subs?
man.
You guys are really pouring it out right now. Okay, thank you. So I do think, though, that I'm kind of underselling it by just saying, oh, the Russians have been stopped in Kharkiv, or the Russians have, been halted, however you want to phrase it. I would say that the Russians have started to break the tip of their spear in Kharkiv. I think they might have overplayed their hand, because it's not just that they're losing a lot of infantry, it's that they're also getting hit over the border and even dealing with, in some cases, encirclements. They engage in a new offensive, and within a month, they have troops encircled in one of the main cities that they intended to capture from where they were clearly marching on, Vovchansk and Lipsky, which is right to the left of it. Let's go through some of the footage and some of the examples I wanted to show you guys. I wanted to first read the ISW report about these soldiers getting surrounded in Vovchansk, and maybe we can look at a map so I can show you guys exactly where we're talking about here. Are they still surrounded? I think they might no longer be surrounded because I don't see it anymore here. Maybe, no, never mind. It's still there. Let's read about it. Ukrainian sources and Western outlets widely circulated unverified claims on June 15th that Ukrainian forces encircled a group of up to 400 Russian servicemen, captured dozens of Russian soldiers as prisoners of war in Vovchansk. But ISW cannot confirm these claims. Ukrainian sources amplified a since-deleted Telegram post from a Russian mill blogger on June 14th, claiming a Russian mill blogger means a Russian guy that does what I do. So he's like me, but he thinks like Bucha was cool, okay? Claiming that an unspecified number of Russian servicemen were isolated in the Vovchansk aggregate plant, and insinuated that Ukrainian forces encircled the Russian forces in the plant. The Telegram amplified footage showing Ukrainian forces capturing roughly 30 Russian POWs in an unspecified area of Kharkiv in the Donetsk area of operations, and suggested that Ukrainian forces captured these POWs near the aggregate plant. The mill blogger later claimed on July 15th that Ukrainian sources exaggerated his June 14th post and clarified that it referenced frontline reports that Ukrainian forces temporarily blocked Russian logistics in Vovchansk, not that Ukrainian forces threatened to encircle Russian forces. The mill blogger claimed that he waited to post about these logistical issues for several days after receiving the information, but claimed that the situation in Vovchansk is still difficult for Russian forces. Okay, so the Ukrainians are calling it an encirclement. The Russian mill bloggers called it an encirclement before then kind of revamping it. Never mind, it's actually just a logistical issue. The logistical issue being encirclement. Point is, though, the picture here is still very shady, very, very wavy. We don't know all the specifics, but this is how it's being reported. This is the headline. Russian troops surrendering after getting trapped in Vovchansk complex. And you can see here where the complex is.
Makuzia gifted 30 tier 1 subscriptions.
30? Okay, let's continue. But as you can see here is the plant that everybody's referring to. This is where the Russians are supposedly encircled. This area around here is marked as a gray zone by Deep State Map. It's marked a little differently under other maps, but I don't really feel like going and digging up the other maps and showing like, well, they disagree here, here, and here. But the idea is that the Russians are trapped here, the Ukrainians are here, and the Russians are there. And so the Russians are saying it's a logistical issue, or the Ukrainians are saying obviously they're encircled. It's both. It's a logistical issue to be encircled. Both can be true at the time. Whether or not the Ukrainians are going to be able to keep this encirclement, make everybody within the encirclement surrender, I do not know. There would definitely be a real motivation on the Russian side to break these out, while the Russians seem to be, let's just say, loose when it comes to infantry casualties in the Vovchansk axis. Having a bunch of soldiers surrender one after the other on camera in front of everyone after you launched this offensive literally a month ago would be a blow to Russian prestige.
Is a curd.
Makuzia gave Hobo Sapiens a tier 1 subscription. Missed one.
Thank you for another tier 1 sub. Putting you at a 31 gifted subs for the night. They just wanted to do one more off the back of the scoreboard into the net. Just one more. I appreciate it though. Thank you. But this is the situation as is being reported, and if the situation is even a little bit true, right? Because we don't know how many soldiers are trapped here. Is it 400? I would bet you that it's not 400. Maybe it's 100. Maybe it's 150. Maybe it's 200. Maybe it's 50, 60, 70. Who knows how many are potentially trapped in this encirclement? But when the Russians launched this offensive over a month ago, and even if the intention was to drag troops away from other areas of the front, which is the big fear that a lot of people, myself included, have, that this is mostly a diversionary operation, because we were saying earlier that one of the reasons why the Russians got their spear broke and have been getting bloody nose after bloody nose in the area, that's not to say that they haven't been doing damage. Lancets, and this is from my conversation with soldier, Lancets are the devil. Lancets are the devil. I passed blown up tanks that were blown up by Lancets. I found M777 howitzer systems in the area that were at the very least damaged by Lancets. There was a lot of damage being done by Lancets in the area. So it's not like the Russians are doing no damage here. And of course, if the Ukrainians are taking more vehicle casualties, even if they're taking less casualties overall, those vehicles still are valuable. And Ukraine has less vehicles than the Russians. But the Ukrainians had to divert troops from the Donetsk region into the Kharkiv area in order to take the fight to the Russians, be able to do some small localized counteroffensives, hammer them like they're doing. And if they did that, that means troops that would have been defending in the Donetsk region, say around Liman or around, say, I don't know, Chasiv Yar or any of the other big spots that a lot of fighting going on right now, or it's an important location, have less troops defending them. And if they have less troops defending them, then the Russian goal, which has been the goal since 2014, is still the goal today, of taking and conquering all of the Donbass, can continue to be pursued with the knowledge that there are now less Ukrainians in their uniforms on the other side of them as they march forward. The Russians have been crawling forward since the fall of Avdiivka in the Donbass, but they haven't been going at a pace that is economical. They haven't been going at a pace that would be sustainable if they wanted to really keep it going. They haven't been able to achieve a breakthrough. And so if you're Russian command, you could easily see a scenario where, well, if we want to achieve a breakthrough, how do we achieve a breakthrough? We move some of the Ukrainian troops that would be fighting here somewhere else. One piece of evidence that someone could point to towards this being the reason behind this operation is that there were recent and I can only call them like distraction operations, as the Russians had some troops cross the border into the Sumy area and put up a Russian flag. Now they lost, like, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 men doing this. They gained nothing except like a slight propaganda victory. There was some talk online. There's been rumors about a potentiality for a Russian offensive in this area forever now. But if you were to do something like that, what would be the purpose? Why throw away those lives so needlessly, if not to try to drag
got
attention
a tier 1
that way?
subscription.
My point being that whether the Sumy operation was a distraction, I think is pretty certain. Whether this was a distraction in the Kharkiv area, it's still a massive question mark. But the Russians do want to take the Donetsk region. They do want to take all of the Luhansk region. They do want to take the Donbass. We know that for sure. And so if they wanted to achieve that, and they wanted to achieve that economically, they wanted to achieve that in an economical way, they would have to divert Ukrainian troops, because they cannot engage in combined arms warfare or use the brilliance of the Russian soul to break through the front line. So they'd have to find some other way. And so that is something that is still like a big cautionary tale that I have to talk about. And this is the last time we talked about this too. But this is something that still worries me, is that what we're looking at right now isn't the offensive. It is the staging operation for the offensive in the Donetsk region. Now that you know that fear, I do also want to throw out there that Russians are getting more and more nervous, because the potentiality for a window like this succeeding could be closing. In fact, I would say it seems to be closing. If this happened, say 3-4 months ago, when let's say maybe back in February, when the shell shortage was at
Burns
its worst,
is an immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
if this happened back in February, I mean, this situation could be much worse, and maybe this diversionary, whatever, distraction operation in Kharkiv could actually be enough to produce a breakthrough. This is all shoulda, coulda, woulda. The Ukrainians are getting ammunition from the United States now. The aid was approved, $61 billion. They are getting aid from the Czech initiative. Other countries are starting to approve bilateral agreements. But the point is, the support has gotten here. And so if they wanted to take advantage of the window of opportunity that the shell shortage provided, that window of opportunity, if it hasn't shut, there's only a slight breeze coming through a crack in the window because there's not much left. And that has led to a lot of Russian Telegram accounts that I've seen starting to be like, okay, what is the purpose of the Kharkiv offensive? Where's the second strike? Where's the follow-up? Where's the purpose? Because if the purpose of the offensive operation was to take either Kharkiv itself, which they never had enough forces to do that, but say what is more believable, get within range, artillery range of Kharkiv, shell it to uninhabitability, and then push upon the city. They aren't able to achieve that. They're not within artillery range of the city. They haven't been able to capture the first two big cities that they would need to capture on the path to get within artillery range of the city. So if that was if the goal was legitimately to build this barrier that Putin talked about between Russia and Ukraine, if the goal really was to get within artillery range of Kharkiv, then that was a massive failure. And from the Russian perspective of the soldiers on the ground, it'd be a massive failure. So a lot of these Telegram accounts are saying, like, where's the follow-up? Where's the second punch? Where's the next step? And so far, there isn't one. And if what we're hearing about May recruitment is also to be believed, and how the Ukrainians are taking recruitment much more seriously now, with reports indicating that they recruited more people in the month of May than the 6 months prior, then that window of opportunity might already be shut. And it could be a situation where we won't know until after the fact that window of opportunity has been properly shut. And then you add increased Ukrainian use of glide bombs into the mix right now, which is something I forgot to even mention. We should have mentioned earlier. Russians are not having a good time. The Russians are not having a good time. The window of opportunity for 2024 could very well have already closed. And the last big offensive before it closed didn't get to the first major city that they would need to take. And they're taking massive casualties to do so. And also, in the midst of conducting these new offensives to try to protect Russia from Putin's perspective, that's why he said he wanted to engage in the Kharkiv offensive. And that doesn't mean that's the real reason. Putin's lied before. But let's just take him at face value. If that is the case, if it is an offensive to take care of Belgorod, Belgorod's getting hit more and more and more by Western weapons because of these restrictions being lifted due to their new offensives, due to their expanding of the war. And that's how it should be talked about. Every time the United States sends a new munition to the Ukrainians, or if we say, okay, fine, you can't fight back in this way too, we call it an expansion. Russians launch a new offensive. Nobody called it an expansion in the media. Nobody called it an expansion on cable TV. Nobody called it an expansion in the written press. But maybe it should be referred to as an expansion, because they did expand the war. They expanded to a new front. But on top of all of this, one of the big things that have been giving trouble to the Ukrainian units is glide bombs. We heard glide bombs today. I heard glide bombs like 30 minutes ago, and I heard glide bombs earlier today when we were in the trenches. And those things are awful. They make an awful sound. It sounds like they're splitting the air. It's terrible, 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 terrible. Problem is, though, that terror is now also owned on the Ukrainian side due to the French retrofitting glide bombs, at least 50 a month, that they're going to be providing to the Ukrainians. They're Hammer AASM bombs. Now, this isn't the only bomb of this type, and there's probably going to be more capabilities given to the Ukrainians as they integrate F-16s by hopefully the end of this year. But let's show you that the Ukrainians, again, once you make this a level playing field between the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Russians don't tend to have a good time. Seems to be the case during the Kupiansk counteroffensive, the Kharkiv counteroffensive. It seemed to be the case during the battle for Kherson. And now that both sides have glide bombs, now it's a question of supply. Can the West give Ukraine the amount of supply necessary to even come close to matching the Russians? Probably not. But if they can get them 1/2 of what the Russians are throwing out in glide bombs, that's going to mean devastating consequences for the Russian army. Let me show you this footage. By the way, can I just throw out there, I talked to a press officer today about who chooses the music for these war videos, because I'm deathly curious, because sometimes it's banger, it's great, it's fantastic. They got some like Cossack warrior singing in the background, he's got an accordion, you know, you're like waving in the seat, you know. And other times it's just god-awful dubstep.
A curd is a curd.
I was told by him, oh,
Frugal has donated $5. If Putin were to die tomorrow, who would replace him? And would the war continue?
I mean, I think who would immediately replace him is less important than who would probably end up being in charge afterwards. And I gotta be honest, I can't tell you, but that's the whole purpose of the Russian system. The Russian system is built so you don't really know who comes. I mean, there's like an official capacity, but you don't really know who really comes after Putin. Because if you have an idea who really comes after Putin, you can start thinking of alternatives. You can start hoping for something different. You can start dreaming for something different. And whoever that something different is can start working towards something different. And so the whole point is to deny the idea of even a dream of something different. As for would the war continue, almost certainly. Whoever would replace Putin would feel incredibly vulnerable, and they would feel vulnerable on a whole bunch of fronts, including the front with the ultranationalists, and they would probably think that continuing Putin's policies might be just the safest bet for their survival, especially if they think that, for example, cutting a deal with the Ukrainians where they give them back most of, if not all of their land, might make them look weak. That might inspire a coup, that might inspire a civil war, or at least, and even if that doesn't, that's the logic somebody in that position is going to be thinking, especially if they come from the Putin class of politician. Anyway, there's at least some of my musings. Now back to this. I wanted to show this glide bomb footage from the Ukrainian side to show you guys, and yeah, they have the ability now too. Let's turn off the music because copyright infringement. Oh my God. Yeah, no, that's how you sink a building into the ground. That's how you eliminate a building's foundation right there. I remember when I was in the Donetsk Oblast, I think for the first or second time, finding buildings with no foundation, just like a whole side of a street with no buildings, or like half of a side of a street with no buildings, just knocked down to its foundation. That's how you do that right there. My goodness. And I do want to throw out there that I'm not just talking about the hammer bombs because I think they're bad. The reason I'm talking about them is because the Russians think they're bad. On Volchansk, the Kharkiv direction, this is from pro-Russian Telegram. In the Kharkiv direction, one of the most intense battles of the special military operation takes place, which can be compared with Bakhmut and Avdiivka. I don't know what they mean by that. Like, I guess on the Russian side, it might be kind of hard to tell the difference because they're taking very high casualties. And, you know, a lot of it's infantry related because this is definitely a very infantry heavy battle. But on the Ukrainian side, I don't know if I would make that comparison because the elements are different, like the ability to strike over the border, the redeployment. Okay, whatever, continuing. One interesting thing, our VKS Air Force attacks the enemy with more than 100 glide bombs per day, mainly in the rear area and concentrations of troops. This is good. The bad news is that the enemy has a lot of his own guided hammer bombs, which also pose a serious problem. It's not easy to fight them. I'm still waiting for the maneuvers near Kharkiv are part of some brilliant plan that the general staff for a diversionary strike. He's talking about what we were just talking about. The attack on Kharkiv being a distraction to pull troops away from it somewhere else so the Russians can punch through the line. Still waiting. And in a month and a half in, they're still waiting. Will that strike ever come? And if it does come, will they have already passed the window of opportunity? Well, all we can do is wait and see. But thankfully for us, all we have to do is wait.